content warning for the briefest of allusions to sexual violence. So it's almost spooky time, and I am so ready. To me, one of my essential spooky time aesthetic standards is Scooby Doo, and you have no idea how hard it was to do that line. I have long maintained that Scooby Doo on Zombie Island is not only the best Scooby thing ever made, which most fans would agree to, but quite possibly the greatest zombie movie ever made, period, with Night of the Living Dead being the only other meaningful contender. Now, that movie takes place on the Harvest Moon, which this year was this past weekend, September 10th, depending on when this goes up. So I decided to give in and get a subscription to Boomerang so I could not only watch Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, but also catch up on the whole franchise. And I have things to say, about 4 weeks worth of things to say. And you guys seem to like it when I talk about cartoons, so I figure, given that I've kind of slipped into a twice-a-month upload schedule at this point, I could do a, quote, month of Scooby-Doo, and that would take us approximately right up through Halloween. So, again, if you're new here, I tend to make videos about philosophy and theology mostly, and when issues related to those come up in pop culture, or the news, I like to talk about them in that context, so that's what I'm going to do here, talk about philosophical issues that arise in Scooby-Doo. Yes. Part 1, Gender Segregation in Scooby-Doo. So by now, everybody's made jokes about the sleeping arrangements of the Scooby Gang.
Boys and girls don't sleep in the same room, silly.
It's Daphne and Velma in one room, Fred, Shaggy, and Scooby in the other, both with 2 beds, and sometimes it's Fred getting shafted out of a bed so Scooby can take one. Sure, it's funny, but even today, this split isn't all that uncommon in real life when renting hotel room. No, dear viewer, the peak of Scooby's sleeping silliness comes from the sequel series of Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, the new Scooby movies. In the Season 2 episode, The Weird Winds of Winona, the one where they meet Speed Buggy, circumstances force the gang to camp by the side of the road, with Velma and Daphne sleeping together inside the van, and Shaggy, Scooby, and Fred asleep in sleeping bags on the side of the road outside. Later in the same episode, Scooby, Shaggy, and Fred are forced to sleep in a barn together with Tinker, Mark, and Speed Buggy of the Speed Buggy gang. Now, I remember watching this episode as a kid and thinking how odd it was. Like, wouldn't you all be warmer and drier sleeping together inside the van? Especially since the villain of this episode uses weather manipulation technology. I know it's the early 1970s, but there's no way in real life friends this close wouldn't just sleep together under the circumstances, especially since this early in the series, the text of the show painted our meddling kids as having a kind of sibling-like relationship with each other. The shipping text would start later in the franchise, but more on that in a minute. So I didn't know it at the time, but I am a bisexual, agender person, and gendered spaces are things weird people tend to hate. So the reasons for non-cis people having issue with gendered spaces should be pretty obvious, but I want to explain the problem bisexual people have with gendered spaces in particular because I feel it's not terribly well known. The implied reason for gendered spaces is the absence of sexual attraction. This is sometimes presented as a deterrent to sexual assault, but there's no evidence this actually works. So if you're a gay or bi male sharing sleeping quarters with a bunch of straight boys, even if gay panic violence weren't an issue, which it very much could be, there's fundamentally something dishonest about being in that space given those expectations. Unless you decide to disclose to your roommates, which is awkward for everyone involved, and can raise the gay panic issue. At least for us bis, it's just easier not to have those expectations. Everyone can be attracted to everyone else. If the thought of mixed-gendered spaces make you uncomfortable, look, I get it, but you should definitely consider giving it a try. For 2 years in undergrad, I lived in a space with co-ed bathrooms and gender-neutral roommate assignments. And it was weird for about 2 weeks, but, then it came to feel normal. And this isn't just as a bisexual male thing either. I recently had a conversation with a bisexual cis woman friend of mine and a fellow field scientist who went on a field expedition over the summer and found it deeply uncomfortable to be forced to share an all-female accommodation. So what I want to do for the rest of this video is talk about how the Scooby-Doo franchise frames relationships between the genders, including how those relationships change as character relationships evolved and as time and appropriateness in culture went on. So caveat that at present, I'm only caught up through Mystery Incorporated and the TV shows. I've started Be Cool, but I'm not done. And Happy Halloween is the most recent movie I've seen. So I might have missed an example. If you can think of an example I missed, please let me know in the comments. The separate rooms thing would be the most recurring motif throughout the franchise, varying only slightly with time. So, for example, in the first episode of What's New, Scooby Doo, we see the gang at least has adjoining rooms. In that show, Daphne and Velma are roommates, dousing that particular ship with lighter fluid, as are Fred, Shaggy, and Scooby, and the idea of Fred and Shaggy being roommates is discussed in Mystery Incorporated as well, though Fred on that show is probably his own topic. It's interesting to note Fred and Shaggy are not roommates in the Mystery Incorporated episode Night Terrors. Night Terrors is the only one of 2 instances I could find where 2 non-married characters of the opposite gender sleep together in the same room. In that episode, while high on terrorwood smoke, a long story, Shaggy and Daphne kiss and then snuggle and then fall asleep together in each other's arms. Daphne is in nothing but a bath towel and a robe. What's interesting here is that the other instance of opposite gender characters sleeping together is also deeply bound up in the Shaphne ship. So, part 2, the Shaphne ship. Oh, I feel like such a degenerate for just indulging fandom's obsession with shipping, but we do really need to talk about it. So most of us who are fans of Scooby Doo are familiar with the Daphne Fred ship and the Velma Daphne ship, but for a while the Daphne Shaggy ship, or Shaphne ship as I'm going to call it, was the ship with the most textual evidence and featured the most subversion of gender segregation in the franchise at the time. Like, Shaggy and Daphne were a couple in everything but name in the 80s, which everyone seems to have completely forgotten, except for us hardcore Scooby nerds. For those unfamiliar with Scooby-Doo's original canon, and yes, Scooby-Doo canon should probably be its own video, after college, the gang went their separate ways. Fred became a mystery writer, Velma got a job at NASA, and Scooby, Shaggy, and Scrappy dicked around in a series of 7-minute shorts of dubious canonicity. Eventually, Daphne got a job as an investigative journalist and hired Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy to be her crew. Those 3 would later form the Scooby-Doo Detective Agency as PIs, making mystery solving Daphne and Shaggy's actual jobs, which they did together. They traveled around extensively together for several seasons, which brings us to the last entry in the original continuity, The 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. In that series, Daphne and Shaggy are heavily implied to be together. They frequently have their arms around each other, Shaggy knows Daphne's feet are ticklish, and most relevant to our discussion, Daphne and Shaggy live together, acting like Flim-Flam's adoptive parents. They also share a cabin on a cruise ship in one episode, so in this one cabin suite there's 2 adjoining rooms, and Flim-Flam and the Doos have one of them, so do the math. I gotta say, Shaphne is probably my favorite ship in this franchise. They seem to have the most in common, both being from wealthy, waspy families, and both being, the most in touch with their emotions in the original continuity, at least. Daphne's also much closer to the Doos, especially Scrappy, than Fred and Velma were, and I think Fred and Velma form a decent ship on their own, too. I mostly think people shipped Fred and Daphne together in the original series just because they seem like the stereotypical jock cheerleader couple, rather than anything to do with their own personalities that might have drawn them together. Part 3, The Reluctant Werewolf. So after 13 Ghosts got cancelled, but before a pup named Scooby Doo, we got 3 Superstar 10 Scooby Doo movies: Boo Brothers, Ghoul School, and Reluctant Werewolf. Now, Daphne doesn't appear in any of these. These movies are not in continuity with each other, and they don't appear to be in continuity with any previous series. Shaggy drives a van very similar to Daphne's van in Ghoul School, but that's about as close as it gets. In Reluctant Werewolf, which also happens to be Scrappy's last animated appearance to date, we get Shaggy's first canonical girlfriend, Googie. Googie wears purple, has a shade of red hair, and an almost identical personality to 13 Ghosts Daphne. It feels very much like Googie was supposed to be Daphne, but some executive balked at the idea of confirming the Shaphne ship, so they made her a new character and changed almost nothing else. The gang gets kidnapped by Dracula, and they spend 2 nights in Dracula's castle. During the first night, Googie takes the bed, while the Doos and a recently lycanthropized Shaggy sleep on the floor. The second night, the night before their race, Shaggy needs to be well rested, so Shaggy takes the bed, and Googie sleeps in a wingback chair. This is chronologically the first time a non-married man and woman are depicted on screen sleeping in the same room, and it's Shaphne by proxy. Part 4, Conclusions. As a franchise in its 6th decade of life, Scooby Doo offers a unique view into the changing mores of gender segregation and what it's appropriate to show to children. In the show's early days, it took gender segregation to an absurd degree, even though the gang were treated as mostly asexual. By the 80s, affection and even cohabitation were deemed acceptable, so long as it was kept to implication. By the time of modern Scooby-Doo, Mystery Incorporated, which is about as openly sexual for a children's show as one can get, co-ed sleeping is used mostly for shipping drama, and it's therefore still coded as sexual. Platonic co-sleeping still hasn't been normalized in real life or in the context of the show. I would love to see an episode where the Mystery Machine breaks down in the middle of nowhere, and we cut to a sleep cute shot of the gang snuggling together. If I've guessed my audience correctly, most of you would like to see that as well. So give me a like and subscribe if you have not, if that's what you're interested in seeing. I just want to say that I've had a couple videos picked up by the algorithm lately and have gotten almost 100 new subscribers in the last month, along with many warm comments. I've tried different things, sort of looking for an audience that would be supportive. A lot of my theology videos are filled with people who disagree with me, hate watching me, and that's kind of emotionally exhausting. It's been really uplifting to receive positive feedback, especially from the autistic community, whom I've been advocating for. If this philosophy and media content is something my audience really wants, I will be happy to move more in that direction. I also want to thank folks who've stuck with me while I was preparing for my doctoral candidacy exams and the subsequent health issues I dealt with as a consequence of ignoring my health for those exams. I'm hoping to find normality soon and hopefully be able to go back to a weekly upload schedule eventually. Thanks everybody. Bye folks.